On November 9, 1938, a series of state-sponsored violent pogroms erupted across Germany. The Nazi government and their followers torched synagogues, vandalized Jewish homes, schools, and businesses. 100 Jewish men, women, and children were murdered, and around 30,000 Jewish men were arrested on this night. We remember these events in the English-speaking world as Kristallnacht, or the Night of Broken Glass. My name is Leiderman, and I'm a young woman living in what is today the easternmost city in Germany, Görlitz. My husband is Jewish, and when I joined his family, I was both amazed and saddened by our family's own history with the Shoah, the Holocaust. It was out of a passion for preserving our family's story that I got involved with preserving Jewish history here in Görlitz. Through this passion project, I have been privileged to speak with both Jewish survivors and their descendants who were once part of the pre-World War II Jewish community here in Görlitz. Tonight, I have the honor to share with you a roundtable discussion with 4 of these descendants of this once prosperous Jewish community. I wanted to know, what were their stories? How did the Nazis' rise to power affect their families, and what are the lasting effects of it today? How were their families, their mothers, their fathers, their grandparents affected on this horrible night, Kristallnacht? To give you some background, we do have some accounts of Kristallnacht and the time leading up to it here in Görlitz. Kurt Fischer, a member of the Fischer family, a Jewish family who owned a department store here in Görlitz, recalled first seeing graffiti saying "Jews get out" in the Stadtpark in 1931. In the following years, the situation became worse, and at the synagogue, services were deliberately interrupted, and vulgar graffiti became a common sight on the doors. The Oberlausitzer Tagespost, a newspaper, recalls this event in their issue from November 10, 1938. They said, "In some Jewish shops in the city, a few Görlitz citizens volunteered to clean up the mess as a way of showing their disgust. The junky Jewish bazaars along Steinstrasse were ransacked from top to bottom. In addition, other Jewish shops on Bismarckstrasse and on Grünengrabenstrasse were affected. We further learned that spontaneous civilian house searches took place in some of the homes of the city's Hebrews." Another eyewitness testimony tells us about the ransacking of the office and home of Dr. Albert Blau, a Jewish physician. Oskar Frummeltz, Dr. Blau's German neighbor, said, "The men all stank terribly of schnapps. My wife was pushed aside and the violent gang fell into the house. They smashed everything in sight with their axes. Works of art, pictures, porcelain, furniture, household appliances, office equipment. All of the books and beds were cut open and shredded. His scientific and office equipment was destroyed, and all of the jewelry disappeared." But that's enough background story for now. My goal today is to be a listener, like you. So without further ado, I introduce Lador Vidor, which means from generation to generation. A conversation with Tim and Stephen Locke, Judi Hannes Mendelsohn, Peter Arnade, and Tamara Meyer, as they talk about their family stories and how they survived the horrors of Kristallnacht and the Third Reich.
I'm Tim Locke, and I'm actually the great-grandson of Martin Ephraim and Hildegard Ephraim. Martin Ephraim was the person who ran a great big factory in Görlitz up to about 1920, and he built the first Jugendstil house in Görlitz. And by the time the Nazis came in, he was actually in Berlin, so he moved to Schreiberhau, where they had a house, and then for safety he moved into he thought it'd be safe to be in a city. And I don't actually know what happened to him during Kristallnacht. We don't have any records of that. He married Hildegard, who's actually a Protestant. That's in that right-hand picture there, and she was from the sort of eminent Protestant family in Görlitz. Hildegard Rauter, she was called, and she was one of the first German women to go to university, apparently. Got that right. So what actually happens is that their daughter was they had 3 daughters and a son, and one of their daughters, Vera, was my grandmother, and she had actually moved to Dachau by that time, to the town of Dachau. So it's kind of their story, which I know much more about. So there are really two aspects of Kristallnacht for me. One is the sort of horrible things that actually happened the day before Kristallnacht, and the other thing is the actual positive impacts of Kristallnacht commemorations, which our family have been involved with after that. So that's in the middle. There is Vera Neumeier, born as Vera Ephraim, a daughter of Martin, and she was married to Hans Neumeier, who's the blind composer, and that's my mum and uncle in 1938 in Italy on holiday, in fact. That's the family, and when they came back from Italy in end of summer 1938, that they had almost immediately plunged into dreadful things, because Kristallnacht obviously happened in November, but in Dachau actually started a day earlier, and then in the rest of Germany. I suspect it's because it was the 8th of November. It wasn't a very big Jewish community in Dachau, and there was no obvious happening on that day, but they very quietly, the officials from the town went around and told everyone on this horrible list on the right that they had to leave by sunrise or else go to the concentration camp. And our family is number 4 on that list. Neumeier, Johann, and zwei Kinder, it says at the end, 2 children. So they were taken out. That was their house on the left in Dachau, and it was a pretty miserable experience. I think I've got my mother's talking about it in a moment.
We had just come back from a holiday in Italy. My father was in Berlin learning how to make flutes, and my mother and the 2 of us were alone in the house when about 8 o'clock, 2 people from Dachau town hall, I suppose, from the burgomaster, arrived to say we would have to leave our house by sunrise next morning or else be sent to prison. So my poor mother, of course, didn't know what to do. We went to our vicar, the Protestant vicar, asked him for some help, but he said he didn't know what he could do for us, better just go. So we just packed a case and left before sunrise and went to Munich, to the station there. I think we had a yogurt in the Molkerei. For some odd reason, they seemed to have guessed that we were a bit odd, arriving with a suitcase early in the morning, and they said they didn't want us in the station. So luckily, my mother had quite a lot of pupils in Munich, and she managed to get us into the loft of one of her pupils, where we stayed for some days.
And the next day, that the Dachau plastered this slogan up: Dachau somit judenfrei, Dachau's hereby free of Jews. And indeed it was. There wasn't any left in the town at all. But it was fairly peaceful. I suspect what happened, what they had the day before, is because the Nazis wanted to go to Munich on Kristallnacht following night and cause lots of trouble there. So maybe that's what happened. They actually camped out on the first night in someone's loft I don't really know what happened, but my mother never described what happened that night, but that would have been Kristallnacht itself in Munich, and presumably they just missed it. It didn't happen to them, so fortunately they weren't involved in it. That's actually the railway station where they went to the Molkerei, and had a yogurt for the turfed out by the authorities. Now, moving on to the more positive side of things, in 1988, it was the 50th anniversary of the Kristallnacht, and Dachau town wanted to mark it in some way, and my mother was invited over as a guest of the town with my father, and they wouldn't. My mother said she'd only come over on two conditions. Firstly, that they put a plaque up to the town hall to the Jewish people in Dachau who were thrown out that night, and secondly, that they would she'd be able to talk to some school children of her age when she went over there, and Dachau said they wouldn't do that. Until this wonderful man, Hans Holzheide, who Stephen mentioned earlier, my brother mentioned earlier, who's a journalist who'd written this book about the families in Neumar who'd been thrown out. They're my mother and uncle again on the cover there. And he stirred things up in Dachau quite a bit. And as a result, they let her come over and talk to some school children. And they put up this plaque at the town hall to the Jewish family. So and it mentions Hans Neumar, Vera Neumar, and one or two of the other people who concentration camp victims from Dachau later on. And then she managed to get to talk to school children. This was actually on a later visit, but they really took to her and held on to every word she said. Really, there she is, a third from the right in the front row there. And then in 2018, my brother Stephen and I were invited back to Dachau to kind of do the same thing. And it was really rather a wonderful visit. So something positive did come out of Kristallnacht for us. That's a revisit to the house. We stayed actually in the house next door to that house. So we looked straight over it. And we were invited to give a talk at the town hall, which is absolutely packed. I thought it'd just be like 30 people, but I don't know how many. Stephen might be able to remember. It must be like a couple of hundred people there, out there outside in the street as well, and there are cameras and someone filming it. So it's quite a big thing. And they had some music playing. They had music by our grandfather being played, and there was a ceremony outside, a wreath laying outside by the plaque. And the next day, Stephen and I gave a talk to a very attentive group of children at the school who asked very good questions afterwards. So we're delighted to do that as well. And then the school children came round with us on a tour of town, polishing up all the stolpersteine around the town. There they are outside our grandparents' house in Dachau, and doing a lot of polishing and lots of ceremonies. So that was actually a great thing to be involved with. And to our rather surprise, we went inside the house, and the owner of the house, is now turned into flats, presented us with this bedspread with a picture of the house on it. So we sort of almost got the house back again. That night we had interesting tours. That session we found there's a street named after the Neumeyers in Dachau now, very close to the camp in fact. And there's a little memorial underneath about the family Neumeyer. And finally we went, the last thing on that Kristallnacht commemoration evening, the pastor from the concentration camp took us to see the Protestant church where my parents, where my mother and her parents went to in Dachau. It's actually called Adolf Hitler Strasse in its time, but it's now called Frühlingsstrasse, happily. And a very odd thought occurred to me while we're there. Is that we were there at about 11 in the evening, and we thought, gosh, this is exactly the same time as my mother on that recording said we went to see our vicar, and he told us what should you do? Just leave town. There's nothing else I can do for you. And on the right there is a very hazy photograph of the front door. I think they must have gone up to that front door, knocked on the front door, and decided they had to leave, went home, packed their cases, and went off to Dachau station on to Munich. So that was kind of the story, my story on it. I also found very recently a letter my mother wrote in 1977 to a friend, and she didn't really sort of express her emotions very much about anything. So I think she kind of liked to draw a line underneath it, but she did say, "I intensely dislike these November days. They bring back horrible memories of a sinister past." Anyway, that's all from me. Okay.
Wow, Tim, thank you so much for sharing your story and to see so many visuals with it. It's incredible to hear. I think it's such a gift that you and Stephen were able to speak to so many students. I think that's so important. And also using the Stolpersteine also as a teaching tool, which is something we're hoping to do here in Görlitz as well.
The other thing I meant to say was, for me, it was a tremendous moment being in that town hall, talking to the people of Dachau, such a friendly audience, which there wasn't a very friendly audience when my mother went there in 1988. I think it was the town council was a bit sort of mixed about that going. It was such a friendly audience, and actually giving a sort of public memorial to grandparents Stephen and I had never met. That was rather tremendous, actually. I don't know if Stephen wants to add any thoughts to that at all.
No, just to endorse what you said, that it was deeply moving, and I'd like to think we had a bit of impact on those we spoke to. Certainly, I was astonished by the level of interest in what, for many people, is quite distant history. But they asked incredible questions, mostly in English, some in German, and they were absolutely on the ball. I was very impressed, and I think it's a great tribute to modern day Germany, to be honest. Even a small town in Bavaria, which has, to be honest, a very checkered history, has shown that it can overcome these things and turn itself into a modern and open-minded place, which is, I thought, pretty amazing. People are still digging out bits of the history, aren't they, Tim? And there are one or two lively controversies about who did what and what happened to whom and all that sort of thing. But generally, I thought it was a deeply moving and wonderful experience.
One small correction to what I just said earlier about Martin Ephraim, his wife, is actually his mother was one of the Lesser Ephraim. It was his father, and Lesser Ephraim married Henrietta Philipson. It was Henrietta Philipson who's one of the first women to go to university. Sorry, I got that slightly wrong.
Well, thank you so much, Tim and Stephen, for sharing your truth with us and your story. It's a pleasure to know you both. So thank you so much. I don't know if you guys talked among yourself who was going to be next to introduce themselves, so I'll mute myself. Judi, do you want to go next? Okay. Don't forget to introduce yourself.
First, what I want to say, education is paramount. And that you have an opportunity, Tim and your brother, to speak to school children is just so important. And I think we must continue to do the education. So hello, my name is Judi Hannes Mendelsohn, and I have a brother, Steve. We are the children of Ruth and Wolfgang Hannes. Our father was born in Görlitz in 1910, our mother in Berlin. We're the grandchildren of Flora and Fritz Hannes and the great-grandchildren of Amanda and Max Hannes. The Hannes family was one of the prosperous Jewish families who settled in Görlitz. Amanda and Max moved from Leibnitz to Görlitz in the 1890s and built a very successful wholesale toy and leather goods business, Hannes & Company, first located on Jakobstrasse and then on Hospitalstrasse. My great-grandparents, Amanda and Max, had two sons, Fritz and Ernst. Fritz was my grandfather. Tragically, Ernst died in World War I, And both my great-grandfather Max and my grandfather Fritz died during the Spanish flu epidemic, sadly leaving Amanda, my great-grandmother, and my grandmother Flora widows. My father was 8, and his brother Gerhard was 6 when their father died. Amanda, our great-grandmother, was one of the founders and board members of the synagogue. She cared for my father and his brother while their mother took over the business. She made sure that the boys attended services in the synagogue. They knew they better show up because she always looked for them in the children's section. She was also the first chairwoman of the Women's Help Society of the Jewish community. While I don't have any firsthand information from my family about Kristallnacht, both of our grandmothers were in Berlin during Kristallnacht, and Amanda, our great-grandmother, was in Görlitz that time. I can't even imagine the terror they experienced that night. My brother and I, along with my husband, traveled to Görlitz in 2010, and we were able to visit the homes of my father, my grandparents, and my great-grandparents. We were warmly welcomed into each of the homes, and they were extraordinarily interested in my family, what they had done in Görlitz, and what happened after the war. We also visited the cemetery where my grandfather is buried, as well as my great-grandfather and uncle. We visited the synagogue, which at that time was under renovation. It is truly a miracle that it survived. In 1941, our great-grandmother Amanda was deported from her home and marched through the streets of Görlitz to the Tromsdorf camp. She was 81 years old. Her longtime housekeeper grabbed a coat and ran after her because it was so cold. Being old and frail, the march in the cold winter, along with the hard labor that she was forced to endure, she could not survive and she perished. Earlier this year, we found out that Amanda is actually buried in the Jewish cemetery in Görlitz, along with her husband and her son, Ernst. We had no idea, as her name is not on the monument, and we had always been under the impression and told that she died on the way to Auschwitz. Her name will soon be engraved on the monument. At this time, I would like to extend my deepest gratitude to Lauren Leiderman, who was on a mission to find any living descendants of Amanda Hannes, as someone at a synagogue meeting mentioned that there was a request to commission a Stopferstein at her last residence before she was deported, and nobody knew who Amanda Hannes was. And then she found me. Also a thank you to Daniel Brutman, who was the person who requested the Stopferstein. We will also be installing them for my father, his brother, and our grandmother Flora at that last residence. I don't know if you can see this or not, but this is my father in the room he was born in. In 1991, he was 80 years old when he traveled back to Görlitz and stood in this room that he was born in. He called me from there, actually. And my brother and I and my husband were fortunate enough to be there and spend time in that home. This has been an extraordinary journey of discovery for me and has connected me to a lost heritage and a new world. And now, as a second generation of Holocaust survivors, I would like to share the following. On June 18th, 1981, at the first World Gathering of Holocaust survivors in Jerusalem, the legacy of the Holocaust survivors was read, and we, the second generation, accepted the obligation of that legacy. We are the first generation born after the darkness. Through our parents' memories, words, and silence, we are linked to that annihilated Jewish existence whose echoes permeate our consciousness. We dedicate the pledge to you, our parents, who suffered and survived, to our grandparents who perished in the flames, to our vanished brothers and sisters, more than 1 million Jewish children, to all 6 million whose unyielding spiritual and physical resistance, even in the camps and ghettos, exemplifies our people's commitment to life. We pledge to remember. We shall teach our children to preserve forever that uprooted Jewish spirit which could not be destroyed. We shall tell the world of the depths to which humanity can sink and the heights which were attained even in hell itself. We shall fight anti-Semitism and all forms of racial hatred by our dedication to freedom throughout the world. We affirm our commitment to the State of Israel and to the furtherance of Jewish life in our homeland. We pledge ourselves to the oneness of the Jewish people. We are your children, and we are here. Thank you.
I guess I'll go next. That was beautiful.
And can I just add one thing before we start, Peter? I just wanted to say that we are very proud of Judi as a group, the group of us here, because Judi just was re-granted her German citizenship. And several of the descendants in this group here are in the process of fighting to get back what was taken from them. And Judi, this is a big celebration for her. So congratulations on that, Judi.
Congratulations. Peter? Yeah, listen, hi everybody. Listen, I'm sorry I don't have a formal presentation. I got ill and was unable to prepare one, but I sent some photographs. So I'm Peter Arnade. I'm the son of Wolfgang Karl Arnade, who was born in May 10th, 1927 in Görlitz. And the Arnade family was originally from Loslau, Silesia, which is now in Poland, and had a large industrial business in Görlitz, a suitcase factory with offices and branch offices in Berlin and also in Alsace-Lorraine and France. I grew up with very little knowledge of this background in Görlitz because while I had a very colorful father, German, Bolivian, he didn't really talk much about his childhood in Görlitz. And his focus as a professor at the University of South Florida was on international relations. And so we had spent part of my childhood when we were in this small Florida town where I grew up outside of Tampa, in Africa and in India, and other parts of what was called the Third World at the time. In 1975, when I was 13 years old and my father was in his late 40s, we went to Eastern Europe. And now I come from a very large family of 7 children, but only my younger brother and I, who's Chris Arnade, the journalist, were there with them. And we were in a lot of different countries in Eastern Europe. And it was very rare to go to Eastern Europe as an American. It was behind the Iron Curtain. My father had arranged several visiting professorships and lectures, and the most substantial of which was in Leipzig. So we spent about 5 months in Eastern Europe. And at the end of our trip, we went to Görlitz. And that was a very emotional trip for him, I believe, because he had never been back. And he had never really thought, because he was so focused on international stuff, much about his childhood. He really confronted it when we were there. He took us to Auschwitz. We spent a lot of time trying to determine what happened to his relatives who died there, also in Theresienstadt. And when we returned to the United States, something changed in him. He did 2 things. He began to speak German, which I had never really heard him speak until we went to Eastern Europe, although it was his native language. Spanish and English were his languages. And he went to Israel, not just once, but several times. And when he got back from these trips in Israel, and he told us he never felt more at home than anywhere else in Israel, which was very interesting for him, because that was not on his radar screen ever. Africa, India, Latin America were. He began teaching a course in the late 70s, early 80s on the Holocaust. And then it morphed into a course on genocide in the 20th century. And he was one of the first American university professors to develop a international course on genocide that began with the Armenians in Turkey and went all the way up eventually to what happened in Rwanda. So I believe the trip to Görlitz fundamentally changed him in ways that he didn't really talk about that much, but that was apparent to me. In terms of Kristallnacht, my family was an assimilated Jewish family. They had left my direct line of the family. There were other Arnadas who were Jewish, but my direct line, the Görlitz line, had in 1900 left the religion. As far as I can tell, going through my grandfather's papers slowly, because I read German very weekly, it wasn't so much that they became Protestant as they just stopped practicing any religion. Very secular. My grandfather, Kurt Arnade, was a military officer in the First World War. The Arnade family was extraordinarily conservative, nationalist, and I think the shock of the rise of Nazism posed a real problem for them because they were actually in that kind of right-wing spectrum already, but they were hardly and never became Nazis, of course. That was the furthest thing from their minds. My grandfather needed to get out of Germany. He was an intelligent man. He had been a military officer. He had been awarded the Iron Cross. He knew what was going on. He had a lot of fellow officers who were entering into there was a Nazification of the German army, and he understood what was going on. I've always been curious why, after leaving the military in 1920, after the defeat of Germany, and going to work in the factory in Görlitz as one of the managers with his brother Paul, who perished at Auschwitz, I always wondered why he re-enrolled in the military in 1933. That didn't make any sense to me because the military was not yet Nazified, right? But it certainly, I never quite understood what he did. It was only recently, in learning a little bit about this history, that I figured out why he did that. He was looking for an escape out of Germany, and that was through a private military mission of German advisors to China. It's a long story, but in 1936, my family moved to China. He was forced to return to Germany in 1938 by orders out of Berlin. Saying if he did not return, his whole family and his wife's family would be entirely killed. And being a very clever man, he did return and he quickly escaped. He sent my father and his sister and his wife to Switzerland. I don't know how. My father has stories about it. My grandfather had stories about it. But they ended up in Olten, Switzerland, and that's where they were on Kristallnacht in 1938. Eventually, within 7 months, he received 2 job offers as a military captain in the German army. One was to work in Indonesia, and the other one was to work in Bolivia. And that's where they went. In 1939, the family went to Bolivia, and then 7 years later, they immigrated to New York. So my father really, his whole teenage years were spent in Cochabamba, Bolivia. There were other Arnadas in Germany, some Jewish, some not Jewish, not practicing Judaism anymore. And 10 died in Theresienstadt and Auschwitz, including Paul Arnade and his family, who were in Görlitz. And there's a Stolperstein in Görlitz to Paul Arnade and his family. His son, Herbert Arnade, in Berlin, that family was completely wiped out, save for one person, Peter Arnade, after who I'm named. And he was the only Berlin Arnade to get out, and he immigrated to South Africa. And then Albert Arnade in Cologne was also deported to a camp. He comes from a different branch of the Arnade formerly. So that's the narrative in quick summary fashion. And thank you for including me.
Well, thank you so much, Peter, for sharing your story. I actually learned some new bits of it. I've heard it before, some of it, but you added some details to the story this time, and I'm so grateful to have you as a part of this group, and thank you for speaking with us tonight.
Thank you.
So our last descendant to give us their testimony and their truth is Miss Tamara Meyer.
Could you sing that again? I love that so much.
Me too. Kommt ein Vogel geflogen, setzt sich nieder auf mein Fuß, hat ein Zettel im Schnabel, von der Mutter ein Kuss. Und der Vogel flog weiter über Bergen und Tal, und die Kinder am Fenster sahen traurig ihm nach. Und die Kinder am Fenster sahen traurig ihm nach. That's it.
Dankeschön. It's so beautiful, Mom.
I love that song.
Yes.
You know, that song reminds me of the Kindertransport
I know.
and of children being separated from their parents. And some of them never saw their parents again. It's one of my favorites.
Beautiful.
It's really sad. It's a sad song. You know,
It's a sad song, yes.
you know, it's about the children who never saw their parents again. You know, the children came away on the Kindertransport, and many of them never saw their parents again because they were murdered.
Exactly.
Yeah,
It's so
Yeah.
sad.
yeah, yeah. It's bittersweet.
It's bittersweet.
Yeah, but I was so lucky.
You were so lucky.
I was very lucky. Yeah,
You were. You
Yeah.
were.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
You know,
Thanks
Mom.
to my sister, I was very lucky.
Yes.
Yeah,
And you and your sister had one another, and your mother, you were lucky. You know,
Yeah.
Mom, remember that lovely woman in Germany, the American who you met? Her name is Lauren. She's a beautiful young woman whom you met. Her name is Lauren, but you met her on the computer.
Oh, yeah, I've written to her.
You have? Oh, that's so sweet.
Yeah,
Listen,
you know,
she's
well, you know I wrote to her because she wrote to you, and I wrote to her too.
Yes, that's right. That's
Yeah.
right. Mom, she had a question, and I wanted to ask
Oh, you always have a question, Tammy.
That's a
Okay,
good question.
make it quick.
Oh, come on. They're good questions. So
Now go ahead, do it.
you were in Berlin on Kristallnacht.
Yes.
Do you remember anything from that night?
Yes,
that
I
day?
do. Yeah.
What do you remember?
My father went into hiding in Berlin. Somebody who was not Jewish hid him in their apartment, so they could not, they could not take him away. So he was safe somewhere. I don't know where he went, but some German people hid him. They were not Nazis. In Berlin.
Do you remember anything about that day or that evening?
I just told you what I remember.
But what do you remember what you saw or heard or
Oh, Tammy.
anything? Do you remember anything about Kristallnacht?
You know, it's difficult for me to tell you that right now. It really is. Yeah. It really is. It's really difficult. I can't really tell you about that right now, about Kristallnacht. It was terrible. When the Nazis looted all German Jewish stores. It was terrible. I do remember that. you know, all Jewish stores were broken into, you know, everything wasn't all, you know, there was glass everywhere, broken glass, you know. That's why it's called broken glass or something, you know. The Nazis broke into Jewish stores in Berlin and all over the country, I think.
Right.
But I was in Berlin at the time, so it was the safest place to be. It was a good place to be, Berlin.
Mm. Did you see any of it?
What?
Did you see any of that?
Well, I did the next day, I think, or so. You know, everything was still broken. You know, I went to that Jewish school, and it was very close to where we lived. And yes, I still remember seeing, you know, the stores, you know, that had been looted into, you know, in Berlin. And I do remember that. Had been broken into.
Did you, and yet you went to school the next day? It was safe to
I don't
go?
know if I didn't went the next day. But I went back to school, yes. But not, maybe not the next day.
Right.
When it was safe to go back to school.
Mm.
When it seemed safe. And you know, my father, you know, there was this Jewish orchestra, the Kulturbund. I've told you that. And my father took me to my first concert there at the Kulturbund. And I saw my first opera there at the Kulturbund.
Right. You mean after Kristallnacht?
What?
You mean you saw the concert after Kristallnacht?
Yeah, it sure did.
So he was not in hiding for too long?
Well, you know, my father did, you know, but we just stayed put in our apartment.
Did anyone come to your door?
No.
Oh,
No.
my goodness.
No. No.
Could you hear anything outside or?
Oh, Tammy, come on. I don't remember. I must have. There must have been a lot of noise, you know. We stayed inside.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It must
We
have
didn't
been
move.
frightening.
Nothing happened.
It must have been so scary.
Yeah. Yeah. But I know my father went into hiding, you know, and I think some German people, some people he knew hid him.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Hmm.
They were some good Germans, and they were friendly. They were anti-Nazi too, and they were, you know, they protected Jews in Berlin.
Right. That must have felt good. But so he just remained there for a little while, but not too long.
What?
He was not in hiding for very long.
No. No. Because, you know, they were able to leave Germany very late. You know, when the war had already started, they were able to leave Germany because of my sister, who knew someone at the American embassy or something. She had a boyfriend there, and he moved their quota up. So they left in 1941, I think.
Exactly.
Yeah. Your mother, you have to give me some credit. She doesn't have too bad a memory. She remembers that.
You have
Some
an
dates.
excellent memory,
Some dates
Tom.
she remembers. Some dates. You know.
Yeah,
I also haven't forgotten my wedding date. I haven't forgotten that.
That's good.
Yeah. Nor have I forgotten the date when you were born. I haven't forgotten that either. Or when Kathy was born, or when Paul was born. I remember those dates too. And I haven't forgotten my birthday either. Don't you forget it.
I'll never forget it.
Yeah, Tammy, yeah.
So Lauren is doing a presentation in Görlitz about Kristallnacht. So that's why I was asking you about your memories, because she's doing a presentation. They're honoring, you know, the Jewish community of Görlitz this year on Kristallnacht.
Yeah.
Which is very good. You know, she's really helping people remember what they may not have wanted to remember, or learn what they didn't want to learn.
Yeah.
So now they're learning about what happened to the Jews in Görlitz, and that's why I was asking you.
Yeah. Well, we were no longer living in Görlitz then. Luckily, we were in Berlin.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Do you remember, you told me a story a long time ago about a teacher who made the children really angry at you, and that's why your mother decided it was time to leave Görlitz. Do you remember that?
You know, I was so young when we left Görlitz. And we left Görlitz because, to move to Berlin, because it was safer there for Jews in Berlin. And I went to a Jewish school in Berlin.
Do you know what made your mother decide to move to Berlin?
No.
Mm-hmm. Because that's what you had told me a long time ago, that she was afraid for your safety.
No, I don't remember, Tammy.
Yeah.
Yeah. But I know we left Görlitz and we moved to Berlin, and I went to a really great Jewish school there. Really was a Jewish school I went to in Berlin. And we had wonderful teachers. You know, they were teachers who were no longer Jewish teachers, who could no longer teach in German schools. So they were particularly good teachers. So I was very lucky. I went to a very good school in Berlin.
Right. You've talked so much about the Holdheimschule.
Oh, yeah, Holtheim school, yeah. Yes, that's what it was called. You know, I don't know who Holtheim was. He was also famous, Holtheim.
Really?
You should look him up. Yeah.
Okay.
It was Holdheim. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, today we're all getting together, you know, the children of Görlitz parents, and we're going to talk together about meeting sometime in Görlitz.
Okay.
and Lauren is arranging for Stolperstein for our family members, including you and Gertie and your parents.
Uh-huh. Okay.
Yep.
Well,
So.
Okay, Tammy, but it's a very special day today.
It is.
And I thank you for doing that.
Okay, Mom.
Okay. You have my support, Tammy.
Thank you, Mom. Thank you so much. Thank you.
No, thank you for doing it.
My mother and her family, Ursula and Gertie Totschek, and my grandparents, Walter and Bianca Totschek, were all living in Görlitz. Walter was born in Görlitz to Ida and Adolf Totschek. And he married Bianca from Bromberg, and they settled in Görlitz. My grandfather inherited a store, a business from his father. It was the Totschek department store. I actually have a photo here that I know Lauren has it as well, but that's actually my great-grandfather, Adolf, standing in front of his department store in 1885 when the Kaiser came to visit. And his store is festooned with all sorts of decorations in honor of the Kaiser. So things began to be really dangerous for my family in Görlitz at the rise of Nazism. As all of you, I think my family was also very prominent. It wasn't a city where you could hide very easily. My grandparents were well known. It became more and more dangerous. My mother tells a story. I asked her about it today, and she, of late, has not remembered the story. And she says it could have happened. But what I recall her telling me a long time ago was that she was one of the last Jewish children in her school, and her teacher pointed her out and asked the children to throw rocks at her. And she came home from school kind of torn up and, wounded. And that's what made her mother decide to move the family to Berlin. My grandfather was not so happy about this, but it was just time. They had to move for safety. So on Kristallnacht, my grandparents and my aunt and my mother were actually in Berlin. And when I spoke with my mother today, she says she just remembers it being a very, very scary time. My grandfather had already been hidden. He was not arrested. My mother's father, that is. She says in her recording that I sent to Lauren today, there were good Germans, and they hid my father. So he remained with some German friends of his, non-Jews, for a few days. My mother doesn't actually remember how long, but she said it was very dangerous, and they stayed in. She doesn't recall how long it was before she went back to school, but she said when she finally left their home on Marburger Strasse off the Kudamm, if any of you know Berlin, she said it was just broken glass everywhere, and there was rubble everywhere. And she made her way to the Holdheimschule, which was the wonderful Jewish school that she attended. My father is also a German Jew, and he is from Mannheim. And just to kind of connect to the Locke story, on Kristallnacht, my grandfather, who was an industrialist, he owned a large company that employed some thousands of Germans in southern Germany. They had a manufacturing company that manufactured Meisenware, and they also had stores throughout southern Germany. He was arrested. He was on Kristallnacht. He was marched through Mannheim until dawn, and then he was taken and interned at Dachau. So that's where our families kind of come close together there. So with regard to Kristallnacht, my mother's family, my father's family had very different experiences. My grandfather on my father's side was in Dachau for a year, and he signed over his property and was allowed to leave. And at that point, he and my grandmother were able to leave. And my youngest uncle were allowed to leave Germany and finally made it to this country. My father and his brother were in boarding school in Switzerland at the time, so they were already out of the country. It's just been a remarkable experience for me, and it's really been life transforming to meet you, Lauren, and have this connection to Görlitz that I really had felt was broken. I've been back to Görlitz quite a few times, first time with my parents in 1998. And this is when we were still in a litigation and struggle to get our house back, our building back, this beautiful building that I showed you a photograph from the descendants of the bookkeeper who basically stole our business, who was given our business after it was no longer legal for Jews to own it. And it was very hard being back in Görlitz at that time. It was sad. I felt this extreme connection to the city, and also a lot of bitterness when I was there. And I think I was really, probably taking in my mother's feelings as well. Just to be back in this beautiful city, and yet this was also the city that had, rallied against my family and all of our families. No one really protected my family in Görlitz. And all the times that I've come back to Görlitz on my own since then, I felt kind of a lot of sadness. The last time I was there, actually, I had been working to put together a team to restore our business. We had finally been able to succeed in this lawsuit with the descendants of the bookkeeper, but due to a lot of unfortunate happenstances, by the time we got our building back, it was in a terrific disrepair and needed millions of euros of repair. And it was with, again, a lot of sadness and mixed feelings that I came back to Görlitz and met with the Burgermeisters. I had brought back a developer from the United States and a developer from Berlin who happened to be Jewish. I had an archivist from Berlin, an art archivist, a translator, an attorney, and we all had this wonderful meeting in Görlitz with the intention of trying to put together some funds to restore our building. And unfortunately, it didn't ultimately pan out for a number of reasons, but I really have been feeling so differently about this city since I've met you, Lauren. And I've even been toying with the idea of buying a little apartment in Görlitz, just to kind of have a foothold. I believe I was the first, according to the German embassy, I was the first American to receive German citizenship as part of Holocaust reparations, and that was back in 1997. So I have my citizenship, and I've been thinking of kind of reconnecting in a larger way by having a little property in Görlitz. So that's a very small part of my story, my family's story. And I guess I also just want to say that it's meant so much to me to meet all of you, children of descendants. Descendants, children of other Jews from the Görlitz Jewish community, and I'm so looking forward to meeting all of you in person, and I feel like I already have. Excuse me. I'm kind of overcome here a bit. I guess I want to show a little bit of show and tell. I want to show one other item. When my grandfather, that is on my mother's side, the Totscheks, Walter and Bianca, and my aunt Gertie, were able to get out of Berlin and Germany in July of 1941. My mother had already escaped on the Kindertransport, as had Tim and Stephen's mom. My aunt recalls the Nazis just grabbing art, silver, gold, anything of value, and putting it on a pile, just ransacking the house. And my grandmother had already sent one of her servants to Holland with some of the family valuables, some of which we did get back. But her one stroke of defiance, and she could have been murdered for this, was to grab a small statue that my grandfather brought into the marriage with him and put it under her fur coat. And this is it. It's a Rosenthal, this beautiful statue that I now have, and it means a lot to me. So it was just, you can see how it was kind of ripped from its pedestal. That's what she did. So that's my little story. And oops, I want to thank everyone for their beautiful stories. And thank you, Lauren, more than anything. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you so very much, Tammy, for sharing your story. I don't know if you can hear my kids screaming in the background, getting ready for bed. I apologize.
You know, Tamara, go ahead, Lauren. I'm sorry.
Oh no, please, I was going to say, I'd like to open the floor for any comments or discussions in the group before we wrap up.
That wasn't me. Can I just add one thought, which is about where Görlitz is in Germany? I mean, obviously, as you all know, Görlitz had either the fortune or probably the misfortune to end up in the German Democratic Republic, and indeed right on the edge of the German Democratic Republic, on the new Polish border, which was part of the Oder-Neisse line. I was fortunate in some ways to visit Görlitz while it was still behind the Iron Curtain. It was quite difficult for Brits to go there, so I actually went there illegally while in transit to Poland. But what was remarkable about it, on the positive side, was you had the impression of a town that was frozen in time, quite remarkably so, actually, at a time when West German cities and even some East German cities had really transformed quite a lot because of rebuilding and the like. But Görlitz was a kind of backwater within the GDR. I don't think the East Germans cared about it at all because it had lots of historic buildings which they didn't particularly value. And it didn't have, at that time, that much industry either. But in some ways, Görlitz now, I think, has the advantage of feeling more German and more historic than many places you might see in other parts of Germany. And that's something to treasure, actually. I mean, I don't think it was a lot of fun living in Görlitz in the 40 years of the GDR. I think it was a pretty harsh existence. And certainly to judge from those of my relatives who stayed in the DDR, and there were several of them who mostly lived in Dresden, you had to basically keep your ideas to yourself. You had to worry all the time about whether Stasi were listening out for you. But they knew from their friends and from people they could trust that nobody really believed anything the government said. Nobody believed anything they were taught at school. And so, in a sense, it was only after the Wende that there was this real kind of awakening of what Germany was all about and what had happened in history and what people needed to learn about beyond the Marxist sloganizing which they'd been taught at school, most of which was just rejected. So I say this image of a city that was frozen in time is something I shall always remember, because certainly 1984, I think it was like stepping straight back into 1937 or something like that. It wasn't much destroyed. Most of the old buildings were still there. Most of them looked incredibly dilapidated. There were only a few trabbies on the streets and cobbled streets everywhere, and the sound of silence as you walked up and down, because there was nobody much around. I think the city's population had gone down a lot too. So it was a strange, eerie, and slightly disconcerting, but also rather wonderful experience. I
echo that. I mean, I spent 3 weeks in Görlitz in 1975 as a 13-year-old. We had already been in Eastern Europe, in Budapest and Prague and Leipzig and the old DDR. But Budapest and Prague were gorgeous cities. But I really had very strong memories of my month and a half in Leipzig and Görlitz. It was an utter police state. There were all these I was kind of into rock and roll and music, and so I was really attuned to like the young people and what they were doing. I was close to 14, and there were all these disaffected youth. They looked like pre-punk, actually, wearing jeans jackets and smoking cigarettes and kind of listening to what I would think of kind of like pre-metal music, and people whispering under this and that. You couldn't speak openly about anything. And I think that's one of the, I think there's two reasons I never went back to Görlitz. So my father went again in the 90s with several of my siblings. That was a wonderful trip. I also had two young children, looked like a toddler and a newborn, and I wasn't able to go for two reasons. One, it's going to combine Tamara and Stephen's points. One, I I had this very strong sense, having visited there and hearing what happened to my father's family, that this is a place I didn't want. How could these folks done this to my family and to all the other Jewish inhabitants of Germany and Görlitz? And especially bitter, I think, for my grandfather, who was a very patriotic nationalist German. And then second, so I just thought, I don't want to go to this place where they treated my family so horribly. And the other reason I didn't go back, I think, is because it was a dump. I mean, it was a grimy, awful place. I'm afraid. I mean, that's my memory of it, right? I had been in beautiful Prague and beautiful Budapest, and then we went to Görlitz, and it was dilapidated, and it was dark and rainy, and we met a lot of my grandmother's family who were in the party. They were Communist Party officials. And of course I didn't understand anything. I didn't understand German. Everybody was speaking German. So I guess I was intrinsically turned off because of those experiences.
Just to add a little bit for people who maybe aren't as familiar with Görlitz, I'll just add this little bit to kind of connect what you and Stephen were talking about. Görlitz was actually the largest completely unbombed city in all of the German territory. The bridges were blown up. Görlitz used to be a bigger city. Today it's the border with Poland, but the Polish side of the river, actually Görlitz, was at one point also Görlitz, and this is where Peter's family's factory was in the Moyes neighborhood. But because of this fact, in the GDR, the communist government did not have enough money to tear down the buildings. They did not have enough money to fix the buildings. So the buildings stood there. And because of that, today, Görlitz has more nationally protected monuments of importance than any other city in the current country that is Germany. I mean, so in a sense, the whole city is is a living, breathing memorial. And we've been very lucky here in Görlitz to have a lot of interest in restoring these buildings and restoring these places. And to kind of summarize the experience of Kristallnacht in Görlitz, I feel like we can't finish this conversation without talking about the synagogue, which is the only synagogue in the state of Saxony, as well as one of the only ones in Germany to have survived the events of Kristallnacht. And there's a lot of different stories as to why that might have been. The one that I tend to believe, because I've heard it the most, and I find it the most plausible, is the fact that one of the heads of the Nazi SS unit had a villa near the synagogue, and it was a very windy night in Görlitz, and he didn't want his house catching on fire. And so when people went to set the building on fire, they had orders very quickly to stop it. And it's been a labor of love getting this synagogue restored to its former state, but it will be I think it will be a very small opening than what was originally planned due to COVID-19. But in December, it is scheduled to be reopened as a cultural forum and also to have a smaller synagogue inside the building for Jewish families here in Görlitz like ours. So that's also something that if you're watching this wherever you are in the world and you're interested, there's a lot of very exciting things happening with the preservation of Jewish history here and sharing stories like the ones that you've heard tonight. So if anyone has any other thoughts, I think we'll close this talk for tonight, but I hope that this is the first of many, that we have discussions about Jewish life and Jewish people, your descendants, from this crazy little place in the world called Görlitz. So thank you so much for your